Hi, marketers. This is Dots, and welcome to the Marketing Leadership Podcast. For me here is Heather Osgood, founder of True Native Media Podcast Advertising. Today, we'll be talking about why podcast ads should be part of your marketing strategy. Now, I know there is a conversation going on about why podcasting in general should be part of your marketing strategy. But why would that be interesting from Dots, who likes to connect the dots and go future proof? So you might be lucky listening to this. You want to get in as fast as possible. Heather, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Absolutely. An honor, incredible honor to have you. As an analyst, you see all the players in the space, watch from afar. Now it's not afar, it's very close. So thank you so much for doing this. For those who don't know you, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and all the great successes that you've made?
For sure. Yeah. As you said, my name is Heather Osgood, and I'm the founder of True Native Media. True Native Media is a podcast representation agency. And what that means is that we work with podcasts. Our role is to connect them with advertisers. We've got about 100 shows that we work with currently, and we go out into the market. We work directly with brands. We also work with ad buying agencies to place ads on their shows. And I
Mhm.
founded the company about 8 years ago. I had an advertising sales background and sold a company that I owned and started listening to podcasts. And I was like, wait, where are all the ads on these shows? There should be more advertising. And at that time, you had to have at least 50,000 downloads per episode for
Mm.
anyone to talk to you about advertising. And I thought that that number seemed really high. I started the agency to help service kind of mid-level shows and have, of course, grown it over the years. And so we deal with a little bit larger shows now than we did when we started. But the goal is the same. It's to really help empower content creators to make the content that they do such a good job creating by getting ads for their shows, thus allowing them to monetize it.
Yeah, and that's again great with what you do. Um, Part of that is what we'll be discussing today. Uh, when you look at the medium, Heather, like when you look at this podcast advertising medium, and if you are a nerd, we are talking in-stream podcast advertising here. When you look at that and you look at how it's able to help support the overall marketing strategy for a brand, what are the benefits around that? And disclaimer, you don't have to have a podcast to actually benefit from this. Am I right or am I right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think the most important thing to start with is that podcast advertising by and large is host read. And what we mean
Mm.
by that is dots, if you were hosting your show as you are and you had an advertiser, you would be the one recommending the product. And that's really powerful because people are listening to your podcast because they know, like, and trust you. And when you recommend a product or service to them, they're much more likely to go and purchase that product and service. And so, really, just the host read nature of podcast advertising is really powerful. Now, there are certainly changes happening with the space. We have primarily been a host read environment, but we are seeing more announcer read ads. We find that host read ads and announcer read ads work really well in conjunction. But when we think about the results from podcast advertising, it's important for us to look at the level of engagement that there is with a podcast. So, for instance, if you are on social media, we have all been there where you go down this rabbit hole, even YouTube, and all of a sudden you're like, gosh, wait, what am I looking at? How did I get here?
Mm.
You're getting fed so much content and you're consuming it. Whereas with podcasts, they're very, very intentional. You have to have the podcast player. You have to know which podcast you want to listen to. You have to select that episode. So the listeners are there for a very specific reason, and they tend to be much more engaged. We
Mm.
also find that in terms of content consumption, that on average, podcast episodes tend to be about 40 minutes in length, 30 to 40 minutes in length.
Mm.
And most people consume 80% of that. So if you take that and you compare that to our TikTok, Instagram, YouTube
Yeah.
obsessed world where we're like just
Icons.
going through the content, we have this audience that is very engaged and they're very present. And so you have this opportunity as a marketer to put a product out in front of that engaged audience, which really delivers a high level of branding for your company. It delivers a high level of association with this person that someone already really knows and likes. And then we find that in terms of conversions, that conversions can be very high. And that's why we see a lot of direct response advertisers in this space.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would like to take a little detour into the benefits for podcasters themselves.
Mhm.
If chance that any one of them here is listening, maybe there's a chance there because you're probably busy making your own podcast. But let me just take that chance. You mentioned something which is really important, which is, the podcasting game has become more accessible to publishers now. It's usually you need to have 50,000 downloads. There's an RCM calculation behind that. And now it's sort of gotten way much less in terms of the barrier to entry. But what I still see in general, feel free to speak to it, is I don't see a distinction between the B2B podcast network for advertisers and the B2C podcast ad network for advertisers. For you to, and the reason why I think the distinction is important is because B2B, the audiences are very small.
Mhm.
You might have a handful of listeners, but they are most likely listening to every episode. They are listening in depth. But if you got a crime or a religion or a spirituality podcast, then that's for most people. In my case, it's gonna be music or history because those are my other passions aside marketing. So, where do you see the industry in terms of trying to make these distinctions for advertisers that want to advertise specifically into B2B podcasts? Uh, or B2C podcasts, and for even in publishers that want to get in, and get into the action, as they would say.
I think it's really important for us to establish the purpose of a podcast. And oftentimes, the purpose of a podcast is as a marketing vehicle in and of itself, right? And when we look at B2B podcasting, I find that that is the case most often is that someone has started a podcast because, maybe they are in insurance, or maybe they're in investing, or maybe they're in marketing, and really, they're creating this show because they want to create thought leadership for themselves as the owner, the CEO, or someone higher up within an organization. And so I always feel like it's really important for us to define what the purpose of the show is. I have a
Yeah.
podcast myself called the Podcast Advertising Playbook, and we talk about podcast advertising. Now, I have a really small audience, as you said. If
Mhm.
I meet, a friend for coffee, she's not going to be super stoked to listen to my show, right? It doesn't pertain to her lifestyle or her career, and so she wouldn't consume that show. But
Mhm.
I don't have the podcast so that I can make money off of podcast advertising. I have the show because I'm passionate about the industry. I want to help educate the industry. And I also really want to make those connections for the clients that we work with that, hey, here's a good path on how to succeed with podcast advertising. So I think it's really important for us to look at it from that perspective. And then
Yep.
as we are looking into monetization, I think it's also really valuable to see that there are lots of different ways to make money from a show. And I think often we feel like advertising is the path that we should go down because it feels, I think, like quote unquote easy to people. Like, oh yeah, well, I'll just
Mm.
get an audience and it'll be easy. I'll just get ads on my show and I won't have to do much and then I'll make a lot of money. But the
Yeah.
reality is that we always have to look at it on a return on investment standpoint from the advertiser's perspective.
Mm.
And often that advertiser is going to need a fairly substantial audience to see the conversion rates that they're looking for. And that's why it is important to have an established audience. Now, you might have an established audience of 100 subscribers, and that can be very valuable to you, the podcaster, especially if you're looking to sell your own products or services. But from the perspective of an advertiser, that
Mhm.
scale might not be there. Now, when we're looking at obviously the B2C space, we do see scale with that in a bigger way. And that's why you're going to see a higher level of advertising on those shows. However, large business shows sell exceptionally well. So if you do
Yeah.
have a B2B show and you are able to reach that critical mass, advertisers love business, marketing, finance. Those are very engaged listeners that can convert at a really high level. So I know that I just laid a lot out there, but I really believe it's so important for us to always start with what is that goal and why are we producing this content? And then we look at the monetization piece.
No, no, I and your point is fair and very valid because I think the nature of B2B podcast as a start and B2B podcasting, doing marketing in a way is sort of catching up with B2C or D2C anyway. So the nature of it is more, you know, thought leadership,
Mhm,
uh selling your own stuff.
mhm,
Um we've even seen things in the SaaS space where people are looking for product adoption
mhm,
of a certain product line. I- I've worked with Meta. I still work with them on podcast promotion stuff. And in some cases, they are looking for awareness for a certain job role, which I thought was a very interesting objective for certain podcast episodes. So this has happened, so I can say that. So you're right. I think because of that, we're seeing all those things come up, uh, and until we start to see, the evolution of B2B in itself, uh, get into some of these other types of, I guess, objectives, or again, like you said, if you really, 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 really outperform, or you grow your podcast using some of the podcast growth tools out there, then you might be able to get involved as a publisher. And then of course as an advertiser, like you said, it's if you get the right B2B podcast to advertising, it's it's all is often great because B2B comes with a bit of seriousness too as well. Heather, I don't know if you noticed. So um which is why we do as much as possible here to crack jokes, even though those jokes are very dry. So yes. Okay. Very, very good, answer so far. So much wisdom already, but we're just halfway. The next question really is when you look at the ads targeting perspective, like I said, I may or may not have a podcast, but I want to advertise inside a podcast with the audience that I want. From an audience targeting or discovery perspective, how do you help brands find the right mix of behavioral and contextual targeting? So behavioral is, your habits online. Contextual is the content online that you're looking at. How do you get the right mix of that to get the best brand results, from audiences? And I'll say, and I'm asking that question because it is my sentiment, and I hope that is changing. I think it's changing that podcast targeting for ads is sometimes pretty broad. It is real estate, ad
mhm,
tech.
mhm,
We have a customer that we do promotion for, and they're in the commercial real estate space. But there is nothing like that in the templates
mhm.
of commercial real estate because they probably rank 300 position in real estate, or in commercial real estate they rank number two or number one in the world. So how do you have the most accurate targeting possible for podcast advertising so that people can get a bang for their buck?
Targeting in podcast advertising is definitely an evolutionary process right now.
Mm,
So,
exactly.
it really does depend a lot on the type of advertising that you're doing in this space. So if you're interested in buying programmatically, there are lots of targeting capabilities, but if you want to buy host read ads, then the targeting capabilities are not going to be as great. So when we think about buying programmatically, of course, you're going to have that announcer read ad. And then you're going to have to use some sort of, a service like the trade desk or something like that to purchase your ads. And if you
Mhm.
go to that measure, then yes, you can target. The information that we have about podcast listeners really is smaller than the information that we have about the average, online person. And the
Yeah.
reason for that is because really, I think it does have a lot to do with privacy. But when you think about listening to a podcast, granted, it depends a lot on where you're consuming it, but Many listen through Apple, many listen through Spotify, and now, of course, we have a lot of listenership happening through YouTube. Well,
Mhm.
those entities are not welcome to sharing their information with us. Now, you can certainly
Mhm.
go to Spotify and purchase through Spotify, and they can help you with targeting at a high level. And obviously Spotify is very aware of who is actually listening to the podcast because when you use that Spotify app, you have said, "Yes, please track me. Please, you know, I
Right.
will tell you
Yeah.
who I am, and then I want
Mm.
you to, to track me. I want you to target me." Whereas Apple does not allow for that, and YouTube really is very new in terms of the way that we're consuming podcasts through YouTube and the types of
Yeah.
ads. Granted, YouTube is very clear about how you could target using YouTube ads.
They
That's
probably have the best.
right, app for sure, but that's gonna be a very different buy than buying it kind of through the podcast channels. So, it really depends a lot on the type of buy that you wanna place, and, of course, something that's gonna be more targeted is also going to cost more, typically because of those targeting layers. It's
Yes.
also really important to think about the size of the audience that you're looking to target. And every time you put any sort of a parameter around who it is that you're targeting, your audience is going to get smaller and smaller. Now, you're going to be targeting the right people, which is going to be more valuable to you, but it is going to get smaller. So my
Mm.
recommendation is that if you're not looking to do that programmatic advertising and you really want the power of the host read ad, is to look at it from a more contextual
Mm.
basis. And so when we think about that, we do have to think about the type of content that it is that we're advertising on. So is there a certain genre that's going to work well for you? Is there a certain topic that is going to be a good fit for you? And then we always recommend that as you're putting a campaign together, that you think about building in a test period. And really what
Mm.
that means is you're going to create a campaign, let's say, between maybe 5 and 10 shows, and you're going to do the best you can to target, and then you're going to see what works and what doesn't work. And the things that work, you're going to double down on. And the things that don't work, obviously, you're going to stop doing those. And really, it's just about iterating on that to get to that place where you can create real success.
Yeah, and thanks for really breaking this down. You said something that I earlier. You said it twice now, and I'm like, yeah, we need to trash this out. In terms of ad format, podcast advertising,
Mhm.
what's the difference between the announcer ads and the host read ads? Yeah, I think you're not the first person that have told me that host read are more effective than programmatic. So now we know that. But announcement or announcer ads and host read, what is the difference between those two?
So, an announcer read ad is just going to be a produced commercial. So, if you think about any sort of produced commercial that you normally hear, whether it's while you're listening to Pandora or Spotify or the radio, anytime you
Mhm.
listen to a produced audio ad, that's an announcer read ad. Whereas a host read ad is going to be the host of that podcast that is doing the ad read. And the way that
Mm.
I look at it is that you you're going to hear an ad, and if it's a good ad read, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's an announcer or a host read ad. You're going to key into it. But as we talk about the host read ad, the value of that is really the endorsement that is coming along with the host. And I kid you not, working with hundreds of podcasters, podcast hosts turn down advertisers far more frequently than you might think. They've vetted
Wow.
that brand.
Too much money.
They do.
Mm.
It's crazy. I'm like, "Really? Are you sure you don't want this company? They're gonna pay you." They're like, "No, I don't like it." But they've built the audience. And I think too that
Yeah.
that's one of the that's a big separation between a lot of mass content out there that we consume. This host has worked hard for every listener. They've worked hard to build this audience, and they want to bring products and services to their audience that they feel are really going to benefit their audience. And so that
Yeah.
endorsement, having that host say, "Oh my gosh, let me tell you, Shopify has changed my business." That's going to be so much more powerful than, you know, a a canned kind of ad that is just coming from a production company.
yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of rejections, I mean, uh, one of I call them the digital marketing baby boomers, Amy Potterfield. I just learned recently that our podcast does, I don't know if it's 10 million monthly downloads or annual downloads. So those people will definitely, have a choice on whether to take something or not. So,
Mhm.
yes, you gotta build the audience, which I think is awesome. And thanks for clarifying the formats there. I personally have not heard of announcer ads before. I know so much about the outstream. I'm starting to know a lot about the in-stream, but this is the first time I'm hearing the announcer ads. And guys, if I've learned something, hopefully I've learned something. And what does that mean? That means your friend, your enemy might even learn something. So please share this podcast episode with them. Like I said at the very beginning of this, I know there's still a lot of discussions on why podcasting itself should be part of your marketing strategy. We are going a step further to say why podcast ads should be part of your marketing strategy, because you really don't need to start a podcast to get into podcast advertising. So please share. It helps us out as well to continue to do this and create the best content possible for you. Now, I have one more question for Eda, which I think is a very, very important question, especially for businesses that are looking to drive brand and commercial value out of podcast advertising. So you don't want to go away, just stick around. But we'll have a quick break. We'll come back, and then it's going to be the dots rapid fire. It's a very, very flaming fire, and we'll see if Heather survives. Stay tuned. Guys, welcome back. So, like I said, Heather right now is in the hot marketing kitchen, where she's going to stay in for a couple of minutes here. She's supposed to answer three questions and say the truth and nothing but the truth to escape that kitchen. So, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. First question: what is your favorite marketing metric apart from sales or revenue?
It's all about traffic. If you're not getting enough traffic, and that could be people walking into your business, people going onto your site, then you're not going to be able to sell products. And we know that that's the end goal. So, really, that traffic is the most important piece.
Even though a lot of people try to bastardize the term, because some people drive word traffic, then they criticize traffic altogether. So, what do you tell those guys?
I think that if you're doing your marketing well, then you're not going to get poor traffic. And if you're set up correctly to convert well, then traffic is a good thing.
Yeah, love it. Okay. Second question is a bit less technical. How long do you use social media every day for work?
I That is kind of a hard question. So my social media is LinkedIn.
Mhm.
I don't go on too many other platforms. And I have a social media support person, and so my role really is to go in and make sure that the posts are doing well, that I'm commenting, and that I'm engaging as much as possible. And so I would say I probably spend somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes a day.
Oh my God, that's so impressive. Wow. Like, 1 hour is the most popular, second to two. What we've seen people do, especially in the journalism space, one of the leads, not the main lead. Thankfully, the main lead has said yes to this podcast. It's just so happy. Of Pod News, said they spend like 14 hours a day because they are scanning the latest news. And as Heather released the new thing that we need to put into our newsletter,
I
something
have too
like
many
that.
other things to do. I don't have enough time to spend too many hours on social
Yeah.
media.
Yeah. I've got a support person too. I um I think I'm good within the 1 hour block,
Yeah.
to make occasional rants and comment on people's posts and things like that. So yeah, that's very healthy. So stay there. You're good. Okay. So the final rapid fire question: what is your favorite marketing quote?
So, my favorite quote is half of my advertising spend is wasted. Trouble is, I don't know which half.
Yes, it was. Jeez, why do I keep forgetting the name? It's a very popular quote, not the most popular. The most popular quote, just to let you know, is the branding is what people say when you're not in the room. And I think you mentioned that at some point in the beginning. So that's the most popular quote. But this is probably one of the second or third most popular quotes. Can't remember who said it. Say it
Well,
was
I they said
1930s.
the
Do you know the
internet said that it was John
John
Wanamaker.
Wanamaker? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Brian just helped us
yeah.
there. Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Okay. And I guess it leads us to the last question, doesn't it? People want to know the full half, the full count, the full crop of their podcast advertising efforts. Now, you know, where I was speaking to the other guests, and we are like, we are coming from traditional where you hope for the best and see what sticks, and going to digital where you feel you know what somebody is thinking before they do it. And now we are coming back to the mid ground, right? So if you have a brand that is click obsessed and is saying, "Hey, Heather, how do I know that this thing is making money? How do I know that this episode is making me money?" And all these obsessions over attribution, you know, how have you been able to, I guess, help people measure the return on their podcast advertising spend? What are some of the techniques you use, capabilities, maybe metrics and things like that, that at least put them at ease and allow them to present something to their leadership before they get fired?
Yes, I know that the tracking results is always the most important piece. So, the gold standard, certainly in the podcast space, has been to have some sort of a strong call to action and then use a promo code or a landing page. And, when I started in the industry, that's all we used. And there was a lot of success that was seen through that. And I think the hardest part about that is essentially that's just online couponing, right? And if someone isn't going to use a coupon, which is essentially a promo code, then you're not going to know. I think the other big issue that I see that happens with this is that the marketer thinks like, yeah, this is a call to action that we use all the time. This is great. So what they do is it's a call to action that they're using in lots of other places. So it's
Mhm.
difficult to narrow it down into the podcasting space. And then also it happens frequently where maybe I don't remember a specific URL. I just remember, oh, hey, it was HelloFresh. Well, I go on
Yeah,
HelloFresh's site and suddenly I get a pop up, which with a much better offer, perhaps than remembering the promo code would give me. And so I mean, the trouble is, especially when we're talking about, direct to consumer brands, they're all gonna
yeah,
have some sort of a pop-up on their site. And we're not gonna convince them to take it down. But that can be a real challenge because maybe we've created this awareness, we've driven the traffic, but then we're not getting really the points for having sent that consumer to the site. And so,
mhm,
not being able to attribute that buyer back to podcasting can be hard when you're just using those tools, and that's why, as you alluded to, attribution tracking really is the gold standard now, I would say, in terms of how to track results. There are several different companies that are doing attribution tracking, which is
mhm.
just pixel tracking, right? So we're able to place that pixel on the podcast and on the site, and then we're able to see where conversions are taking place. And that
Right.
really has been the very best way to track results.
Mm. Have you had any luck with analyzing attribution from podcast ads by correlation? So we ran this podcast ad at this time, even though the pixelation is not working or accurate or even there at all. But we see that whenever we run it, the sales pick up. Whenever we stop, sales stop.
I have not had anyone who has been honest with me in saying that they're using correlation, but I do
Mhm.
think that that's an important piece. The other thing that I've been really trying to preach a lot lately is that for so many years we were talking about, is podcast advertising effective? And it's like we're putting podcast ads in a silo, but the reality is that we have a marketing mix for a reason, right? And it's
Mhm.
because people don't need to hear about a product just on one channel. They need to see it in multiple places. And if I hear an ad on a podcast and then I see an ad on Instagram and then I see an ad, on CTV, I'm much more likely to actually make a purchasing decision. The other
Yeah.
thing that we have to keep in mind with audio is that it isn't clickable, right? And so
Yes.
that can
Which
be a challenge in terms of results. That doesn't mean it's not effective. It just means that if I'm on Instagram and I see the ad and I can just click for more info, suddenly that sale is going to get attributed to Instagram when really it could have generated from podcasts. So it's important as a marketer that you're not just looking at how podcast advertising is performing, but how all of your channels are performing as they're working in conjunction with one another. And there are I'm excited because we work with
mm,
some really great media buying companies, and many of which have just bought podcast advertising. But as podcast ads have grown, we're now working with larger companies where they're buying lots of media and lots of different channels. And now we're able to say, like, oh, hey, my video is performing 3 times better when I run audio in conjunction with the video. So it's important to
yeah.
look at the whole mix.
Yeah. And things like assisted conversions on your attribution software. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like you said, it's still evolving. So we'll see what happens. In light of again, something else you said, privacy. So we cannot eat our cake and have it, unfortunately. So we'll see where we land here as we all continue to ride the podcast wave. Again, thank you so much for doing this. For those who want to ride the podcast wave with you, where can they find you? Where can they learn more about you and about this topic?
For sure. You can just head on over to truenativemedia.com to our website is a great place to connect with us. And I
Yeah,
am very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to message me on LinkedIn, please feel free to do that as well.
absolutely. And what a nice URL, by the way. What a nice brand name. Folks like Tableau, or is it Tableau or Tobla, that do native advertising, they will be jealous of such a URL. So
It's nice
I
and
forgot to put
easy.
that. Yeah, very, very, very easy. I'm always like, what? Why Tableau? Why can't you say native media something? And they just say Tableau, or Tableau. Anyway, I just sign off with that joke. But guys, that's where we are on this episode. You can check more on my website, stoslovesmarketing.com. You can also subscribe to the Marketing Leadership Podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Till next time, connect the dots.
Thank you for listening to the Marketing Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Listen Network. There will be links to resources mentioned in today's show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode.